In this video, I'll be explaining the difference between preterite and imperfect verbs. To start off, imperfect verbs are used to express past actions that are seen as uncompleted, and you can't determine a specific ending of this action. They're used in a more repetitive or habitual way, and in a more general sense. For example, I always eat cereal for breakfast. This is a more general statement since we don't know when always started and when always ended. It's just always. A better way to look at it is if you put imperfect verbs on a timeline, which we'll get to later, you'll see more of a span of time than a point in time like preterite verbs, because we don't know when the action actually started and when it ended, because we're using terms like always. Other terms to look out for when looking for imperfect verbs would be todos los días, which means every day, cada semana, which means every week, cada día, which means each day, de vez en cuando, which means every once in a while, a menudo, which means every so often, and siempre, which means always, like we used in our example over here. If you see a sentence that uses these phrases, then it is most likely going to be imperfect. On the other hand, preterite verbs are the complete opposite. They're used to express past actions that are seen as completed, and you can determine a specific ending for it. They are more precise, and they do have a definite beginning and ending. For example, last year I went to Disney World. At first glance, it may not look as if you can see a beginning or an ending, but if you look at the words last year, we do know when last year started, and we do know when last year ended. Again, if you put this on a timeline, this would be a certain point in time, because we have a beginning and we have an ending. Not like imperfect, where we don't really know when it started or when it ended. We do know when it started and when it ended. Phrases to look out for when looking for preterite verbs would be ayer, which means yesterday, anoche, which means last night, el año pasado, which means last year, la semana pasada, which means last week, and una vez, which means one time. If you look closely, all of these phrases have a beginning and ending. We know when they started, we know when they ended. Like yesterday, we know when yesterday started, and we know when yesterday ended. Same with last night, last year, last week, one time. To try and better understand the difference between preterite and imperfect verbs, these are more of a visual example. With preterite, you have a definite start and a definite finish that you can tell just by looking at the sentence or the phrase. And if you put it on a timeline, it would be a certain point, not really a span of time. Unlike imperfect over here, which is an ongoing and has no ending, and you can't really tell when it starts and when it ends. Imperfect is also used in situations when giving the time of day, the date, the weather, and one's age. These are tricky situations because if you just read them, it would look like you would use preterite, but you actually should use imperfect. Here's the timeline I keep referring to. If you took a preterite statement and you put it on a timeline, it would be a certain point, since we do know the beginning of the statement and the ending of the statement. And for example, I put ayer me comí pasta para la cena, which means yesterday I ate pasta for dinner. And by using the word yesterday, we know when it started and we know when it ended. Over here with imperfect, instead of it being a point like preterite, it's more of a cloud, of a span of time. We don't really know when it started and we don't really know when it ended. It's somewhere in there. We can't really tell by looking at the statement. Our example here is todos los días voy a la escuela. This means every day we go to school. So every single day we go to school. We don't really know when we started going to school and if and when we ended going to school. We just know that every day we go to school. Here are the conjugations for preterite and imperfect verbs. For preterite AR, it should be aste, o, amos, and aro. For ER-IR preterite, it should be iste, io, imos, and ieron. The conjugations for imperfect AR should be aba, abas, aba, abom, abamos, and aban. As you can see, the yo form and the he-she form are the same. Same with ER-IR. The conjugations are ia, ias, ia, iamos, and ian. The yo form and the he-she form are the same. Hopefully this video has taught you a thing or two about preterite versus imperfect, and have fun with the test.